Cardiff today, and we've got a speaker down from London today, Hannah, the Deputy General Secretary of the Socialist Party. Also, she's the author of The Socialist in the 21st Century, and she's going to speak today about
capitalism, socialism, stuff like that.
yeah. So we can start, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, thanks to Cardiff Socialist students for inviting me to speak. It's been asked what I'm going to speak about, and I think I have to start with what's taking place in capitalism at the moment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's the party conference season at the moment. So you've got the Lib Dems, Labour, and next week you're going to have the Tories. And on the economy, they've all got the same message. So Vince Cable did his big thing about facing the long grey days of a depression. Ed Balls at the Labour conference talked about it being the worst economic crisis in 60 years. And the Tories haven't had their conference yet. But Cameron has already said that we're not quite staring down the barrel of the gun, but we're getting there as far as the world economy goes. And there's no question they'll make similar remarks at their conference when it starts this weekend. And they're not wrong. They're wrong on lots of things, as I'll go on to say, but they're not wrong about that. If you look at what's happening in Europe now, the crisis in Europe, the danger of Greece crashing out of the euro, if things go as badly as they fear, could be a crisis that makes the collapse of the Lehman Brothers Bank, which began the world economic crisis back in 2008, what's coming now could make that look like a tea party. We could face an economic crisis worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. There's the prospect of Greece crashing out of the euro, and then the markets attacking the European banks, but also the other periphery countries, as they're called. The countries of Portugal, of Spain, perhaps even of Italy. And the capitalists have no real solution to this problem. Probably not that many of you watch Newsnight, which is the kind of in-depth news programme that takes place every night. Last night, normally I fall asleep in front of it because it's on a bit late and I don't stay up late and so on. Last night was the most dramatic episode, that's not the right word, the most dramatic, it was like an episode, it's like a soap opera, Newsnight that I've ever seen. And it was because they spent the whole programme discussing this economic crisis, and they had every strand, the pro-European capitalists, the anti-European Little Englander capitalists, and none of them had a solution. Literally, this guy from the Telegraph kept calling the man from the European Commission that idiot in Brussels, and eventually the idiot in Brussels tore off his microphone and stormed out of the studio, and they were arguing because they don't know what to do. They're in a blind panic. The one thing, there were really two things they were all agreed on. One is, all of them were talking about the prospect, not of a recession, but of a depression and a slump. But the other thing, of course, they all agree on is it should be us. It should be ordinary, working-class people who pay for the crisis. But it's a sign of the depth of the situation. There are times in history, capitalism is a system driven by the blind desire for profit. It's not planned, it's not organised, and it's always crisis-ridden. But there are times when the capitalists just have no way out. They cannot solve the problems that they face. That was the case in the 1930s, and it's the case again today. Now, of course, they always try, and we're not suggesting that the worst scenario is what is going to take place with the situation in Europe. It is actually most likely that the capitalists will desperately cobble together, probably using the printing presses, inventing the money in reality, the 2 trillion euros they're trying to get together, to act as a kind of safety net and to try and reassure the markets that when Greece defaults, as it will, but they hope in a more organised way, that they don't need to go after Spain, Italy, the banks of Europe and so on. And they will probably managed to prevent the Armageddon-style scenario that I have just outlined very briefly, but it won't stop the collapse of the euro at a later stage, and it won't prevent a further deepening of the economic crisis that we're already involved in. And it won't alter the fact that every government in Europe, whatever their formal political stripe, is agreed on the fact that it will be the working class, it will be young people, it will be the pensioners, who are the ones who are going to pay for this economic crisis. So here in Britain, the banking system teetered on the brink of collapse. The government bailed it out. And as a result of it, we're told that the public sector is to blame. Greedy students are to blame for not paying enough in tuition fees and demanding too good an education. Public sector workers are to blame for wanting a pension when they eventually get to retire. And that is unanimous across Europe, even though it's exacerbating, it's making worse the economic situation. Look at Britain. There's no question the economic crisis is getting deeper because public sector workers have been thrown onto the dole. They therefore don't pay taxes, they can't afford to buy things, and it exacerbates the economic crisis that already exists. But all the three main parties agree in fundamentals that that is the way forward to make us pay for the crisis. I think it will be obvious to everybody that that's the position of the Tory party. Doubtless, because this is a meeting of students, there will be lots of people here. The first time we voted, I was just talking to someone who this is the case for, voted Lib Dem, hoping that the Lib Dems were more radical, supported free education, and have found out the hard way that the Lib Dems in essence are no different to the Tories and have been prepared to go along behind them every step of the way. But even the New Labour conference, if you look at the essence of what was said at the Labour Party conference, it's summed up really by the position that was put on tuition fees. Miliband announced, yippee, that Labour would only have £6,000 as the maximum tuition fee, rather than £9,000. It's like the condems would cut your whole leg off, and Labour would leave you a stump. I mean, it's a little bit better, but you can't say it's any fundamental difference or would be affordable for students. And throughout the conference, I mean, it's very significant. The conference took place in Liverpool. Ed Miliband began his speech by attacking the Liverpool City Council of the 1980s. That was a council that was led by our party back in the days when we were still the left of the Labour Party, before it got too right-wing for us to be part of it. It was a council that stood up to the Thatcher government, that refused to implement the cuts, that mobilised the population and the workforce in support of their programme, had regional general strikes, 50,000 people on the streets of Liverpool supporting the council, and they won, at least for a period, and were able to build 8,000 council houses, or rather to build 5,000 and refurbish 3,000, to create 16,000 jobs, if you like to have a little bit of socialism in the language of jobs and bricks and mortar. Miliband starts his speech by attacking that Labour Council and praising today's Liverpool Labour Council, which along with every other Labour council in the country has bowed its knees to the Tories, has carried out the cuts that the government has demanded. And that, if you like, sums up the reality of New Labour today, that Miliband is not fundamentally different. He said he supported the anti-trade union laws, he opposed any return to the levels of taxation that the super-rich paid in the 60s and the 70s. He made clear again that he's not prepared to support the strike that is coming of the trade unions, public sector workers, on the 30th of November. And yet, if you read the newspapers, if you read The Guardian or The Mirror, the capitalist newspapers, or even more if you read the right-wing capitalist newspapers, The Times, The Telegraph, you would think that Ed Miliband was a member of the Socialist Party, that he had made this speech, which was full of fervour for socialism, for doing in big business, and so on. What did he say in reality? All he did was he dared to mention the fact that some of the capitalists, not all of them, but in his view, some of the capitalists, maybe the bankers who brought the economy to the brink of meltdown and made billions out of it and have been bailed out by the taxpayer, that maybe they have an iota of blame, and maybe we should try and encourage manufacturing capitalism that actually makes something rather than finance capitalism. And for this fervent socialism, he's being attacked as, a mad left-winger. And in fact, his response to that, in the media over the last 2 days, has been to emphasise he didn't mean it, he's not anti-big business, there are lots of good bankers, and to try and retreat from the tiny little shred of something positive, which he said. Not that it was realistic what he said, by the way, because the problem with what he put forward, the idea of the good capitalists and the bad capitalists, is capitalism is a system that is driven by the desire to make, the need to make profit. And that comes before anything else. And worldwide, in the last boom, they couldn't make big profits out of investing in manufacturing in general. Because it doesn't matter that there are 2 billion people in the world without enough to eat, that there are 2 billion people who don't have decent electricity. If they can't afford to buy the products, you don't make a profit out of making it to provide it with those people. So the markets weren't there. And instead, to put it very simply, they gambled on the world stock markets, because that's where the profits were. And you can't change that about capitalism, perhaps above all, about British capitalism. Because British manufacturing, as we all know, is extremely weak, has been smashed for years, first under the last Tory government, then under the Labour government, and now again, BAE closing, cuts everywhere, and finance rules the roost in Britain. And the idea that suddenly, either under Cameron or under Miliband, that British manufacturing will start competing with German or Chinese manufacturing industry, and Britain will turn away from the finance sector under capitalism, that is a utopian dream. Nonetheless, if Miliband had stuck to his guns and actually said, I am against bankers making a fortune, I do think they should be regulated more, it would have been popular with the population. He would have actually started to go up in the opinion polls, but instead, he has the worst of all words. He half says it and then immediately retracts it as soon as anybody attacks him for it. And from our point of view, as socialists, as campaigners, it is a big problem at the moment that if you watch the TV, if you read the capitalist press, if you listen to the establishment parties, because they're all capitalist parties, you're constantly told there is no alternative. You have to accept this diet of misery. Nothing can be done. In order to cut the deficit, you have to pay these tuition fees. In order to cut the deficit, you have to be prepared to work until you're 68 and get no decent pension at the end of it. And that leads, it's completely wrong, as I'll go on to say, but it leads to a certain lack of confidence, a feeling, well, can we really change things? But while that lack of confidence undoubtedly exists, it's not going to stop people fighting back. It can complicate the situation, but it won't prevent people fighting back. Because in the end, people feel we might not win, but we can't accept this. We've got no choice but to get off our knees and to do something about it. Often it's young people who've got, if you like, the most to gain and the least to lose, who are in the vanguard, who are at the front of the struggle, of the fight back. And that's been true in Britain. If you think back to last autumn, it was the students and the school students who took to the streets against the tuition fees who were the first into the battle. And it was a heroic battle. I mean, since it's been described in the media as young people rioting. And when I've been doing socialist student stalls at Freshers' Fairs in London, I have met young people who didn't take part in the demonstrations who think they were just riots. But in reality, they were young people coming out on strike, leaving school and college, and actually were overwhelmingly peaceful in the face of major police provocation. I went on all of the London demonstrations, and it was only after being kettled in the snow, bitterly cold, for 9 hours, being charged by riot police on horses, it was only after all of that and the fees going through Parliament that a minority of students started to understandably vent their anger at the police and at buildings and so on. They were overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations, but they were the first act. There will be more from young people. I'll just say on the question of what were riots, what took place over the summer, for the Socialist Party, rioting is not our method of fighting back. And to go and smash up your own community, your own shops, that doesn't help anybody. And in fact, the riots gave the government an excuse to use extremely repressive acts against young people. When you see young people being sent to prison for 4 years for something they put on Facebook, which didn't even lead to a disturbance, was just a comment on Facebook, or young people being sent to prison because they stole a bottle of water for a year, I mean, incredibly repressive, but also an excuse to introduce the threat of water cannon, of plastic bullets, of measures that will be used against peaceful student demonstrations and trade union demonstrations in the future if they're allowed to go through, so we have to oppose them. Rioting is not our method, and in particular, we condemn the tragic deaths that took place. It's only because of the heroism, actually, of the father of those boys, those young men that were killed in Birmingham, that there were race riots, really terrible problems that developed in Birmingham as a result of those deaths. And of course we condemn the burning of people's houses and cars and all of those things. However, we also say, if you leave young people with no future, if you have 1 million young people on the dole in this country and rising, and you cut off the route of education, and you take away the EMA, it is inevitable that you will get outbursts like this, and it's inevitable more in the future. And what is more, while we don't support rioting, if you're unemployed in this country, you're 3 times more likely to commit suicide. There are reports all the time now of tragedies, of people who've lost their jobs or are threatened with their homes being repossessed, committing suicide. Well, I tell you what, I'd rather people rioted on the streets than despaired. Better that. But what we have to do is not to riot or to despair, but to offer a positive way forward, a positive alternative. Socialist Party and Socialist students are big supporters of Youth Fight for Jobs, and I'm not going to steal Reese's thunder because he's going to speak about this, but that's a campaign against youth unemployment which is giving a positive alternative. It's had a march already from Merthyr with the highest unemployment in the country into Cardiff, but starting this Saturday, it's going to march from Jarrow, as people did in the 1930s, 75 years ago, from Jarrow all the way to London, demanding real jobs for young people, abolition of the tuition fees, restoration of the EMA. And that is very important and can be a big focus of inspiration for young people as it travels down the country. Now, the demands it are putting forward will probably seem to people in this room, certainly all of the capitalist politicians would say, they would seem utopian. Asking that every young people has the right to a decent job, for the restoration of the EMA, for getting rid of the tuition fees, for the reopening of the youth clubs that have closed. But in fact, all of those demands could be implemented. They're possible, they could be done. Just on the last, the question of the youth clubs, I mean, this perhaps seems a minor issue, but in Tottenham, where the riots began, 13 out of 18 of the youth clubs in that area had been shut down by the council, implementing Tory cuts, a Labour council, just a month before. And the workers in those youth clubs had warned, this will lead to riots if you go ahead with this. Well, those youth clubs cost a few tens of thousands of pounds a year to run. They've had to spend a lot more money on the aftermath of the riots than they would have had to spend on keeping the youth clubs open in the first place. And Youth Fight for Jobs in London are running a major campaign to get them reopened. But even on the bigger issues, it could be done. Every young person in Britain could have the opportunity to get a decent job. How could it be done? Well, for starters, we could share out the work. We live in a country where the older among us are being told that we're going to have to work till we're 68 or later, where every worker in this country on average now works 3 hours a week longer than they did in 1981 as a result of people not making enough money unless they work more hours, being forced to work more hours and so on. And yet at the same time, young people in the main cannot get work. You ask the average teacher whether he or she would rather retire at 60 and let a young person come in and run around after the kids, or whether they want to keep slogging away till 68 to literally die in the job. The vast majority of them would much rather retire. So why couldn't the work be shared out with no loss of pay, so that everybody had a decent job and was able to work a reasonable number of hours? That would go a long way towards eliminating unemployment. But there are other things that you could do. Youth Fight for Jobs raises the need for a massive government scheme to create jobs which are socially useful. operations, that is the case in most other countries in Europe. And of course, they're saying it's because it's the National Health Service. We should privatise it all. That's the solution. Well, the BMA came on and said, the reason's simple. It's because we don't have enough consultants. We don't have enough highly trained doctors. If you trained more, we'd be able to make sure that every emergency operation was attended by a consultant rather than somebody less experienced. We've just got to have more people trained to do the jobs. And why not? Why couldn't you have a massive expansion of the health service? More doctors, more nurses, more teachers, so that we could have smaller class sizes. All of those things are possible. Or the question of housing. At the Labour Party conference, they did actually put a little bit forward. They said that a Labour government would create 25,000 affordable homes. They didn't specify that there would be council or social housing, but affordable homes. Well, we would welcome that. But 25,000 is a drop in the ocean. It's nothing. There are 5 million people in Britain who want social housing and cannot get it because there isn't any. Why couldn't they actually build houses on a big scale? I mean, one council built and restored 8,000 in a couple of years in the 1980s. You go back to the 1930s, the only time we've been in a bigger economic crisis than we are now, and at that stage, in 1 year, they built 300,000 council houses. Between 1948 and 1954, in the aftermath of the Second World War, with a huge national debt, they built an average of 230,000 council houses every year. Why couldn't a combination of building environmentally friendly housing and restoring housing that's in poor repair, we build enough houses to meet the needs of everybody in the country, which would also put the building workers back to work, would create jobs and so on. Those are the kind of measures that Youth Fight for Jobs is demanding and that the Socialist Party would demand. Now the capitalists will answer, that's utopian, it can't be done, we can't afford it. They can afford to spend €2 trillion bailing out the European Union, but they can't afford to provide us with the basic necessities of life. A decent house, a decent job, a decent education, maybe even an odd holiday that perhaps we'd like to have. Well, we have 2 answers to them if they say they can't afford it. The first is, we're going to fight for it. We don't accept that. And even though we're constantly told there is no alternative, you have to accept it, that is not the reality. Look at what's happened this year in Egypt and Tunisia. Ordinary people have overthrown brutal dictatorships which seem to be set in stone forever, that were backed to the hilt by US imperialism, and people took to the streets and they brought those dictatorships down. Now it's true, the military are trying to cling to power and the job hasn't been finished, but nonetheless it shows the potential power of young people, and in both countries it was young people that started it, who began the movement, but in particular it shows the power of the organised working class. If you look at Egypt, the situation was dragging on and on, but Mubarak was forced to leave when the trade unions came out on strike en masse. That was the point at which things tipped. And if we look at how things are going to develop in Britain, the trade unions do have the power to change things. The students and young people began it, but then in March of this year, we had 750,000 people marching against the cuts. That was called by the Trade Union Congress, the trade unions in this country, whose membership is smaller now than it was in the 70s or the 80s, but that was the biggest demonstration probably since the Chartists in the 19th century. I mean, you've got to go back a long way for a trade union demonstration of that size. And of course, that was then followed up on the 30th of June of this year by part of the public sector, again about 750,000 workers coming out on strike. Now, so far, those demonstrations and strikes have not stopped the cuts. The cuts are going through at local level. But on the 30th of November this year, as a result of the lead given by the militant trade unions, particularly the PCS, in which we play a leading role, the Civil Servants Union, but as a result of the lead given by them on the 30th of June, all of the public sector unions virtually are now saying that they're going to ballot for strike action on the 30th of November. And we are likely to have, on the 30th of November, 3, 4, maybe even more than 4 million workers out on strike. That will be the biggest strike on one day since 1926. It will be huge. And in British terms, this is not Spain or Greece where they have general strikes all the time. In British terms, it will be earth-shattering. It will terrify the government if that takes place. And in our view, that could bring the government down, particularly if the leadership are serious and make it clear, which unfortunately won't be the case with all of them, we have to fight for this, make it clear we don't stop there. If we don't win on the 30th, we'll come out again. We'll come out for longer, for 48 hours. Next time we're prepared to escalate the action until we bring the government down. What attitude should young people take to that? Well, the lecturers are one of the unions that are coming out. The NUT as well are likely to be out, the teachers' union. We have to make sure that young people don't stay at home that day, but they come out in their hundreds of thousands and join the demonstrations and say this is not just about your pensions, this is about our future as well, and we want to unite together with you against all of the cuts. So we think we have power, we can change things, we can force them back. By the way, if we brought the government down, which is possible, it's a weak government fundamentally, after all the Tories couldn't get a majority, that's why they had to go in with the Lib Dems in the first place, you'd be faced with the prospect of the Labour government as the replacement. And that's why, in our view, an essential part of our role as socialists is we want to build a socialist party. We want you all to convince you to join us. But we also say that everybody involved in this movement, every worker, every striker, every student, should be discussing founding a party that is a mass party, hundreds of thousands of strong, that stands in your interests. It is ridiculous that the trade union leaders, not all of them, but the trade leaders of the big trade unions, go to the Labour Party conference. They give the Labour Party 70% of its funding at the moment. They go to the Labour Party conference and they beg and plead to have their strike supported. Ed Balls says we would also cut pensions if we were elected. And then they go away and say that doesn't mean a rupture with the Labour Party. In our view, that money should be used. We should put the case to union members to begin to use that money to fund and to build a new party. But even a Labour government would intend to carry through the same sort of measures, perhaps a bit more slowly, but if it came to power on the backs of a mass movement having got this government to stand down and an election to be called, a Labour government will be under huge pressure, and it will be possible to force it to make concessions in the interests of ordinary people. We're told we can't change things. It's just not true. Talk to German students. 2 years ago, they got rid of their tuition fees. They weren't just passed through Parliament, they were implemented, they were paying them, and they got them abolished altogether. They were lower than the 9,000 that's threatened here, but you can defeat things after they've become law if you organise a determined movement. In our history, our party in 1990 led the movement against the poll tax, which was where everybody had to pay exactly the same level of taxation, however poor or rich you were. It was grossly unfair. We led a movement against it, 18 million people refused to pay it, and we got rid of the tax. And we got rid of Maggie Thatcher, who'd introduced the tax. She was forced to resign. That was the real reason that she went. We can change things, even in this depth of an economic crisis. Go back to the 1930s. In 1936, the French working people occupied their factories, and they won an 8-hour day for everybody and big increases in wages. That was in the worst economic crisis in world history. But when it came to it, when the capitalists were faced with a determined enough movement from ordinary people, they thought, we've got to give you something. Here, have something. So you can win victories if you're organised, but that's only one answer to the question. The other answer we give to them when they say, well, we can't afford it, is, well, if you're saying that capitalism as a system cannot afford to give us what should be basic, obvious necessities, then we can't afford your system. And actually, the two answers are linked, because although what I just said is true, you can win things, it's also true that as long as the capitalists remain in power, because they're driven by profit, and because that profit comes from exploiting working class people, they'll always try and get it back off you. I mean, we got rid of the poll tax, but then we got the council tax, which is better, but it's not a fair taxation system. When you win better wages, they'll tend to use inflation in order to undermine the wages that you've won. They'll always come back at you a different way. Doesn't mean there's no point in fighting, because if we don't organise and fight back, they'll walk all over us. Whereas if we fight back, we can help to hold them in their tracks to win some concessions. But we think it needs to be linked to a struggle for socialism, for a different kind of society, a better way of running the world. The way the world is run at the moment, where all that matters is the mad scramble for profits for the bottom line, where stock market traders can send whole countries to the wall. I mean, they talk about greedy Greeks. The Greek working class at the moment is destitute. There are people living homeless in the streets. Nobody under the age of 30 has a job. Literally, there's mass unemployment amongst young people. It's a terrible situation affecting the whole of society. On Newsnight last night they had accountants and estate agents organising demonstrations in the courts because their homes were being repossessed. It was not even just the working class. Everybody, the middle class, are being affected. And that's being done because that's what's in the interest of the markets. The same markets who lent them the money in the first place and now driving whole countries to the wall. That is no way to run the world. It is not the best way of running things. If you look at what this economic crisis has meant that we are going through, in 2008 alone, there was $50 trillion wiped out of, like, if you like, the value of the world, of what was produced as a result of the economic crisis. That is probably enough on its own to wipe out world unemployment if that money was used for the good of the population as a whole. Or here in Britain, the crisis means that, according to Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, the economy now is still 10% smaller than it was in 2008. That's £200 billion. The government are cutting us to the bone for £81 billion. Yet there would be no need for any cuts if it wasn't for a crisis of capitalism. So what do we say the solution is? We would argue that the big companies, not every company, but the big multinational companies, the finance system, they should be taken into democratic public ownership. Not taken into public ownership like Labour did with the banks, where they took them over in order to prop them up and then sell them back at a fat profit to the private sector again. And Northern Rock and the others continued to repossess people's houses just as fast, in fact faster in the case of Northern Rock, than anybody else on the high street, but taken over and run democratically by workers, by young people, by students and pensioners, in the interests of society as a whole. That is what we mean by a democratic socialist society. And that would enable you, immediately in Britain, to be able to introduce a 30-hour week, to eliminate unemployment, to give a free education to every young person, because instead of wealth and power, industry being controlled by a tiny elite, they will be controlled for and run by in the interests of the majority. Now, at this stage, the only reason that that idea has not something that has the support of millions, billions of people around the world is because the capitalists hold up and say, that can't work, that's what they tried to do in Russia, and it failed. And that's kind of what they're using in order to undermine the ideas of democratic socialism. But our answer to that is Russia wasn't genuine socialism, it was a brutal dictatorship. It was the first attempt of working class people to take power in the poorest or one of the poorest countries in the world. It degenerated because it was isolated and left on its own. But you're not going to tell us, when you've had 400 years and this is the mess you're making of the world, a capitalist world, that we are going to write off the ideas of democratic socialism because of that one example. Because in fact, it's clear, it's obvious, that if you were able to plan and organise industry democratically in the interest of the majority, then it would be a far better world than what exists today. And even Russia, we don't support what existed there. But you talk to a lot of Russians today, and they will tell you about full employment, housing, crap housing, it's true, but everybody had a flat, they had to work too hard, and a lot of them would say, we didn't support that system, but a democratic version of that, where we could have chosen our flat, where we could have picked what job we did, where we weren't sent to the gulag, would be a hell of a lot better than what we've got in a capitalist Russia. So we put the case for socialism, and we think this crisis of capitalism is going to lead to millions of people adopting socialist ideas, fighting for a different kind of society. It will take time, perhaps, to convince some of you of everything that I've said. But what I hope that everybody's convinced of is the way the world is run at the moment is deeply unfair, is getting worse, and if we get off our knees and get organised, and we can stand up for our own rights and for the the interests of ordinary people, working class people, and the poor worldwide.
Just say thank you, Hannah, that was good. I'm going to open up to have a discussion in a minute, just to let everybody know I'm not very good with names. So I'll probably describe you by what's on your t-shirt. Oh, no, after Reese. Yeah.
Didn't know I had a fan club, right? I start with just start now. Okay, so, comrades, it feels like forever ago since we marched from Berkeley. We've had riots, we've had revolutions, we've had stock market crashes, and for some of us we've even seen the full face of fascism. But the dawning of our next task, I think, will be one of our biggest tasks. You know, we've worked so hard in the last couple of weeks with the freshers phase. Some of us, I think, not all of us, or not even me, I think myself, actually, to be honest, has forgotten all about what we have to do here, and what we have to do in Newcastle, and what we have to do in London. Because I feel that I'm one person, I'm going to do the whole thing. And at the same time, I also feel that there'll be people up there that will be doing the same thing as well. So that means there'll be 50 people, maybe 50 people this year. But next year we'll have 100 people. And that means there's 100 people that won't stand up for capitalism. That means there's 100 kids that will fight for their futures and fight for their rights. I get a little emotional sometimes. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to start crying. I just got to realise I've got to walk from Jarrow to London, and I've got to do it tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the morning. So. Not all of it. I am coming back to see Cardiff City, like I did last night. We went to 1 happy days. But no, I think the biggest question isn't necessarily what we do or how we do it. It's how they do things to us. Because we have to think that they'll tell people to believe in capitalism, and they'll say, well, without capitalism, you'd be still in the gutter. If we didn't give you what you got, what would you do? And I say that they have given us, you know, shirts, everyone here is wearing clothes, we got it pretty easy, we got it pretty cheap. Everybody has a car, we got it all pretty quick, pretty cheap, but that was to advance ourselves. The only way that we advanced our minds was by fighting for it on the factory floor, in the streets of England, in the streets of Wales, in the streets of Scotland, in the streets of the world. And if we're not prepared to go back and do that, then they will always win. Because they will tell you that they... Well, you have to kind of understand how capitalism works first. I can't jump ahead of the gun. Right. So pretty much we live in a society where we must buy, we must buy, we must buy, we must buy. They make their profits, they cut. We go away. We have more people unemployed. We have more youth unemployed. And then what happens? We have more people born into that. We have more people born into that after again. Every generation has the same problem. Different fashion, different hair, different songs, different things to party about. But we still all have the same problem. And they will tell you that without them, you are nothing. But without ourselves joining together, we are nothing. So how can they win? They can't win, really. Because every time they take away from us, we fight back, we get more for ourselves. Because they owe us everything. We owe them nothing. We owe them the 8 hours a day we are willing to work. But then, after a while, once we get rid of them, we won't owe anybody anything. We will owe each other. We will be one. We will be equal. Everybody will be a comrade. And I have written stuff down, but it's not on this, if you can't tell. Right. All about the place of the politics. I'm a ramp. Right. We demand free education. We demand work and minimum wage for people who not necessarily want to be a doctor or a lawyer. We want minimum wage for people who want to cook our food. We want minimum wage for people, you know, who want to cut our hair. Because I don't know if you do it, because I do. I'm a vocational student. I don't know if anybody likes cooking. I really love cooking. But we get put on these placement programs. And this is my broken record time, because I always say this, but it's the best example. We work for free for restaurants in Cardiff, but the college is supposed to be there to educate us. It is to advance us. It is to advance humanity. That is our little obelisk to ourselves, to advance ourselves. Not to advance capitalism, to advance ourselves. But then no. You see these kids with 16, 17, they're in Cardiff, they're feeling tired, so you know, they're making everything nice there, they're going to have, you know, for, well, say 60 quid. But they don't get paid nothing, they get paid 30 quid a week. Now they talk about taking that away. So you've got kids that live up the valleys who don't make anything. They make 30 quid a week. Where the people who eat that food, they make, you know, the cost of their rent. Well, the person who was working in the kitchen would have to work their whole life to pay their rent for a month. And this is the system we live on. So when they tell you that you are nothing, you aren't anything to them. You are just a little worker. You just work, you just work, you just work. But to each other, I don't own no businesses. I don't think anybody here owns it. Raise your hand if you own $1 billion company. Anybody? Anybody? Ed does. Ed does. Everybody from Connecticut does. I've been there. But actually I have. So no, we have each other. We can't, they're leading us down the dark way. They're leading us to cutting back. We know what happens when they cut back. You know what happens. You see what happens. You see them schools that we're supposed to be scared to go to because poor people live in. You know, and why is that? Because they want to give money to those people because they're going to make money for themselves. The only way that we can stand up and make a change is by getting rid of them. We can't do things to each other. We just got to get rid of them. It's as simple as that. I've got to bring it back to this because this is what it's for. And I also have to talk about it because I'm doing it tomorrow. And they be all mad at me for a month and I don't want that. So, we marched from Merthyr to Cardiff. We got the press, we had the radio, the television, all of that. But you think about it now. We marched from the capitalist heart of Wales. Tomorrow, Saturday, I will start the march to the capitalist heart of England. To the so-called capital heart of Britain, because they won't give anybody else the rights for it. I can't go on that because I was on national and all that stuff. But, no, you think about it. We're going to walk through Newcastle. We're going to walk past Luton. I wish I had the map because I'm not that good at geography. The heart of England, to London. And then we'll meet on November the 5th, thousands strong against them. Because there are thousands of people that want socialism. Hopefully there'll be tens of thousands coming soon that will want socialism. And then, when there's more of us than there are of them, and they won't exist, and they won't matter no more, we forget about them. You know? Once we have 2 generations of kids that live under socialism, there will be no more capitalism. There will be no more people who starve in Africa. There will be no more people that starve everywhere else, and they get told, no, you don't get to have food because we get to have food. No, your kid doesn't get to have medicine because our kids have to have medicine. We have an abundance of it, but we just want to keep it for ourselves because that is our system. But under socialism, which is what we're fighting for, that would never happen. So this march is, for some people, it would be just one issue. We are students. We like to wake up early, you know, we are that joke category or whatever for some of the capitalists, which is cool because I like that. I like it when people think you're stupid because then you can do whatever you want to do. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do exactly whatever we want to do because this is our country too. And also the fact that if we don't do it for ourselves, what's not to say that 10 years down the line they're going to do exactly the same to our kids. To the people who we are supposed to give a future for, and they won't do that. Because they inherit the money that they get to their kids, and their kids don't never have to work, so the system carries on. So the only way to change it is to get rid of it. Just get rid of it. But that's me, so thank you very much. Right. Now, incoherent ramblings can also be justified by one thing. I want you to remember this quote, because I've seen it, and it's very good. It is consciousness that determines existence, but social existence determines consciousness. And I want you to think about that. Thank you very much. It's so serious.
Just to let you know, the Youth Fight for Jobs march tomorrow, that starts tomorrow. They will actually march for 350 miles. And Jarrah, because I didn't look at the map, is right up north in Scotland. Oh, and the Welsh comrades are meeting on the 24th of October and joining them for a week or so. So just to open the floor now for discussions on everything that's been talked about from recent and itself. So just pop your head on the sort of hands or lips up. Whoever wants to talk first. Anybody? I'm going to go for Ed. Ed, would you like to say something? Yeah, Ed.
Thank you very much. I'd like to assure the room, first of all, I don't actually own $1 billion company. It would be nice. Because, well, this afternoon, after years as a university student, I submitted my PhD thesis. And since I started in university, I have been a worked in the public sector. I've been on medical leave. I've been a mature student. I've been an international student. I've been a postgraduate. And now, assuming I can find a job, I'm going to become an educator. So I've been through the whole mill of the system. I've seen how it's changed from within. I've seen more and more America brought in. What I was trying to get away from is moving over here to the British system. I've seen privatizations brought in. I've seen fees skyrocket from £1,000 to £3,000 to £9,000. International students, some of us are paying £18,000 a year. I've seen lecturers' hours go up and up. I've seen pay go down and down. There's petitions circulating through the crowd. It's a petition from the lecturers' union, the UCU. They're trying to cut the lecturers' pension, so after they've worked all their lives teaching us, they're getting hundreds of thousands of pounds out of their pension starting 1st of October. I'm trying to say that my union, the UCU, which represents lecturers, will be taking industrial action starting the second week of October against those changes. And we as students need to support them. Why is Megan calling on me? Well, it's a very good question. It's very easy to say no to things. It's very easy to, I was like this for many years. I didn't join the Socialist Party until 3 years ago now. I was constantly saying no to things, but I didn't know what I wanted to replace it with. Here in these discussions, and here in these rooms, we can build those ideas. We can put forward a positive program for change. I'd like to propose, therefore, that to help build for the big Youth Fight for Jobs demonstration in London on the 5th of November, to bring together the students in Wales, across this country, where we face the same attacks from a Labour government as being implemented by a Tory Lib Dem government in England, to point a way toward free education to a fully funded education system. I think that this meeting and that the Youth Fight for Jobs campaign should propose an all-Wales demonstration and an all-Wales meeting and bring together every student group across this country and say, we have an alternative. We are going to show the way forward, and if the government
A smart person than I once said that capitalism is the incredible belief that the wickedest of people do the wickedest of things for the greater good. And no more so do we see that with the current banking crisis. We see Miliband condemning banks for what they've done, and he condemns their unparalleled greed. And yet it was a new Labour government which gave jobs to these bankers within the government. It was the new Labour government which further deregulated the banks that was started under Thatcher. Furthermore, we see Nick Clegg all bluster and fire in his Lib Dem conference. I don't know how many of you have seen With Mail and I, but the more I see of Clegg, the more he reminds me of Richard E. Grant. In the privacy of his own home, he's swagger, he's powerful, he's the person who's going to stop the Tories. And then when he gets into the bar, he kind of just plaintively whines and says he's a heart condition, and if you hit him, he'll die. The Lib Dems try to put themselves forward as a shield, saying without us in the coalition, then things would be worse. And I think that's possibly true. But look at what they have done. They reneged on their promises of scrapping the tuition fees. They reneged on their promises on the banks. The existence of the Lib Dems can also serve as a distraction, however, because it's very easy to focus on the Lib Dems. Because, let's face it, a lot of their policies they adopted because they thought they'd never get into power. But we have to look at the ideological attacks that Cameron and his friends have tried to level on the working class. It's incredible the way the media has worked in this country, where they've somehow managed to blame teachers and dustbinmen and public sector workers for a crisis that is very clearly the fault of not only the banks, but the capitalist system as a whole. I say that I'm a member of the Open University. They racked up their fees to £2,500 for an equivalent course, which, if you work out over the year, is roughly about £6,000 a year for a university education. That's unsustainable. The Open University was the last ship in town for a lot of people as they desperately try to get out of menial jobs. And I can speak to a man who has done menial jobs for £2.50 an hour, because that's the government's new deal. That's what the government will offer people at home if they're unemployed for over 6 months. So the reason why I'm a socialist, I've long said that I'm a socialist economist on a social justice basis. We see what capitalism can do, and capitalism does rightfully point out what happened in Russia with Stalin, the repressive autocracy. But then again, you have to look at where capitalism has got us now. Millions of people destitute, millions of people without any hope of the future. The number of people constantly rising who live on less than $1 a day. They point to Russia, we can point to the entire world and see how capitalism has failed us. I think the only way forward for us is to form a mass party. And I think it's no accident that every great movement in the world has had at its heart a bunch of students who sat around and discussed and had their ideas broadened and realised this is enough, this is what we cannot stand for, and they make the first move more often than not.
Can I congratulate the social students on organising this meeting, which has been excellent, apart from maybe the lighting display. My name is Dave Hardett. I'm actually Secretary of the South Branch of the Socialist Party. I'm also a group executive member for the PCS Union, which Hannah referred to as one of the driving forces in the union movement in the defending of jobs, communities and their services. And I want to come on to that, particularly the action that we're going to be taking, and hopefully in conjunction with the development of the student movement himself. Just before I do it, listening to Hannah was very, very important. I hope everybody takes on those points, because when I was listening to some of Hannah's opening remarks, it reminded me, you're listening to these conferences, it reminded me of the legend of King Canute. You might recall that King Canute stood on the beach and he tried to roll back the tide. Well, all these parties, they should form one party. New Labour, Tories, Liberals, call themselves the Canutists, because that's what they are. They too are trying to roll back the tide of history in reality, in trying to re-establish the good times of capitalism. And it isn't there. It isn't there. Hannah referred to the Newsnight discussion last night, and it was worth watching. It was just one in a million. But you also might recall, a couple of days before that, there was a vast amount of communication on the net, on YouTube, about this Southern Invest banker, this stockbroker, who said, I have waited all my life for this event so I can make billions of pounds. Now, is he a bastard? Of course he is. But more accurately, he's actually an economic terrorist. Because the logic of his position, which if it's only confined to the gambling casinos of Monaco, would be fine. But it's people like him that betting on the systems of money and wealth at everyone else's expense is the problem with this particular system. Everybody, see, in my union we've had this debate of trying to say there is an alternative to this crisis of cuts. There is an alternative, and I'll come back to that very briefly in a minute. But in that alternative, one thing we make absolutely clear is that 2/3 of the mess in Britain, the so-called national debt, this idea that somehow it's the greedy public sector that's responsible for this mess, is an absolute myth. 2/3 of the national debt is because of the nationalisation of the banks. Nationalising the banks, unfortunately, that's not all the problem, that's not all the solution, because they still run them. We've taken over the bad losses, and the banking bosses continue to run and make their bonuses. But that is the reality of capitalism. I read a statistic not so long ago, which I think is so shattering, you can't imagine the sheer scale of it. The future and derivatives market, which started this crisis, remember in the housing market in America back in 2007, when all these housing debts were ran up. This section of the market, the future and derivatives market, it is worth a staggering 783 trillion pounds. Now that is 11 times the sheer total of world trade. And as Hannah was saying, if some of that money was to be invested in developing industry, developing houses, and developing education, we wouldn't be in this mess. But the point is, it's not profitable. It's not profitable enough for them, these playboys, to actually put the money at that section. So what do? They bet £40 billion on the market in one single day, last January, to try and forecast there would be snow in California in January. Now, that is the logic of the system. And therefore, in our union, in trying to make out a case of saying there is an alternative, we point out to the question of the banks, we point out the question of the debt, we pointed out the question of creating jobs, creating services in order to provide a boost to the economy. The Tories don't want to listen. They don't want to listen because they're in it to represent their own class. We, as somebody else has said we need therefore a party to represent our class. But in the next period of time, building up now, I spent the last week, 2 weeks, at meetings on my own group executive in London, on my Wales committee section in Wales, where we've been planning our strategy in our union to ensure that the events that take place on November the 30th are the biggest in trade union history. And if half the unions, just half the unions that said they're now balloting their members for strike action, were to take strike action, we'd be talking about 5 million people. It could be double that, 10 million. You add in their families, their friends, associates, and we are talking about the public sector. We are talking about the majority virtually in population. All this crap of the Daily Mail as they just represent themselves is a nonsense. And that would be a massive boost, I think, for confidence in defeating this government on their proposals. And I'll end on this particular point. I think the role of the student movement has got a vital role here to play in linking that. I think all the working people in the trade unions were inspired by the events that took place in defence to get rid of tuition fees for demonstrations across the country last year. And I think that movement, linking up with the student movement, and the organisations are set up here locally in Cardiff, and I'm sure the Socialist students will publicise that. It's absolutely key in building that momentum, because I can tell you, unity is strength. Divided we fall, united we stand. Never have we had the opportunity to stand together like this.
If anybody has got any short questions they feel like to ask, just pop your hands up as well. Leanne?
Hi, I'm Leanne. I'm a teacher, not a student, but I'm here to support you because I feel like it's really important that you start fighting against this tax now. And I'm not actually allowed to discuss this with my students in school, so I'm coming to discuss it with you instead. But one of the things that David just touched upon is the incredible wealth that still exists in this country, and I mean a tiny number of people. And Hannah's already told us about the fact that there are alternatives and there are other ways to keep the deficit. And I'm not sure if I got this figure quite right, but I think it was the year before last is the figure I read about. There was £143 billion that was lost in avoided, evaded and uncollected tax from the rich, and that's actually not far off from what the deficit actually is. So what we have got at the moment is an old boys club full of old Etonians who are basically maintaining the grow and supporting their rich friends and raking all the money that is there into their own pockets and literally laughing all the way to the bank. That for me is more sickening than anything, because yes, there is a deficit, yes, there is a massive problem which has been created mostly by the rich anyway, but the fact that the small amount of funding that is left for ordinary people is being cut, and we're being expected to pick up the pieces, that's what's most sickening of all. And when I look at the students that I teach who are now leaving to go to university, I'm seeing a lot of them now starting to wonder whether they're going to do it, whether they're going to try to look for work, which is ironic because for every job in Cardiff there are 9 unemployed people. So that's not an option either, really. asking questions. Well, when we're marching, when we're looking for answers, we need to be asking why there's so much money that isn't being paid back into the system by the rich. And that's something we need to do as well.
Just before I bring him in, just a question on that tax. When I was travelling down to Cardiff to move back into student hall, something came on the radio about them trying to get rid of the 50p tax that was on of people that earn over 250,000. Now, if they could afford to get rid of that tax, why they try to charge students £9,000 a year to go to university? So it's like, well, you get rid of money for the rich. Why do we need that money? We need it so much. Keep it in tax in place. Just a point. Mia.
Hi, I'm Mia. I'm a full-time student and a part-time worker. I first became a socialist because I could see that people were starving in this world at the same time as other people had more money than they could possibly spend. That was many years ago, before this financial crisis. Of course, things haven't got better, they got worse. I could see then that capitalism